Okay, so this is the second series for EKS. It's basically setting up a EKS cluster. So if I wanted to show you that these are my manager and workers, and they're all currently in a down state, I am not going to touch them because I want to set up and I'm going to set up the EKS cluster directly from the AWS without using any of my nodes. So if I look for EKS, that's it is Elastic Kubernetes Service, and there is a lot of documentation. So it's pretty simple if you first do it from the console, because doing it from the console, or it can also be done using AWS CLI, or it can be scripted. I have a script in my on my account on GitHub. I'll just show you quickly. So I'll put the link in the video, but it's basically in the Kubernetes. If you go to tech, and that's the AWS EKS. If you see, there is a script and it explains everything about setting it up and what are the steps. So let's go back to EKS. So the first step, as let me see, right? The first step is basically understanding. And then when you set up an EKS cluster, in this case, we'll just set it up in a default VPC, but there is an option to create a new VPC so that you have a fresh new VPC and then fresh subnets. You can create 2 to 4 subnets and then set up the cluster in there. But in this case, it's just basic. I'm going to just set it up using the UI, and then we'll slowly move to the doing more advanced. Okay, so before we create the EKS cluster, there are a couple of things to do, because and we are just creating step by step so that we understand what goes on when a cluster is created. There is also command EKS scuttle that can be used, and it's pretty it does all the things for you. But in this case, I want to set up the cluster, and then I want to use a cloud formation template to do the next step. So before that, okay, so the first step is the VPC, as I was talking earlier. So in our case, I'm not going to create a new VPC, so I'll just use the existing VPC. Another thing is to create the role. So it's important to have an IAM role and then attach the required IAM policies for every time you for each cluster. So what this role does is it basically is allowing your EKS.Amazon the service with the action. It's assuming the role of it. So basically, it is going to make calls to the other services, and there's a lot that goes on after for this cluster. So it needs to have the right permissions. So the creation of IAM role is easy using the AWS IAM create role command. It can also be done from the UI. So what I did was, as I was showing earlier, so let me go to my EC2 instances. I started one of the EC2 instance, my master, just because I'm going to use that as a kind of a bastion host, because it's in a public subnet and it is in the same VPC as my EKS will be. But this should not be, I mean, it should be some other, temporary EC2. But so I'm just going to use it because I already have kubectl installed on it, and I also have AWS CLI. So if I show you, see. So if I show you, it already has AWS CLI and a kubectl. Both of them are installed on it, so it'll be easy. So I'm going to just use this one to create the role. So my account will be IAM create role, and I need to have this is the JSON file. So I need to have the cluster role trust policy JSON file. I'll take this and I'll just save it. But the right thing is it should be in an S3 bucket. So let me make a directory EKS because there are a lot of stuff here. I go in the directory and I'm going to do what's it called, cluster role trust policy. It's a JSON file, and I'm going to just have it, save it. Now I'm going to run this. So I'm going to just copy this. Okay, so it created the policy for me. If you can see, it has the role ID, it has the role name as my Amazon EKS cluster role, and it's created. So now I'm going to look at what's the next step, which is attach the required policy to the role. So now I need so I created a role here, and I have a JSON file in it, and I'm going to run the next command, which is attach policy. I'll just copy it and I'm going to paste it. So I'm doing is I am attach role policy. I have my policy. So we can look at in the policies, we can look at what the Amazon EKS cluster policy does. So okay, these two steps are completed. So now let's go back to the UI, because that's the next. We need to have these things ready before we can create the cluster. So I go back to my console and I'm going to, so this is IAM piece. I mean, like this is for running the CLI. I had to do this. Now I'll go back and I will create an EKS cluster, because now I have the role as well as the policy attached to it. I will do a create name. I will do EKS test, and I'm going to do, well, I can just do test, and I want to pick the latest. 21 is the latest actually. And then my role name, now I have a role there, so the role order automatically popped up. I don't want to enable any inscription or anything, and well, I don't want to add any tags for now. So this is a complicated piece. It's basically asking you for the VPC. So if you have a separate, if there's also if you have a separate VPC, you can work. But in my case, I am just going to use the regular VPC. And why it needs subnets is because the worker nodes will be assigned in the subnet. So I have 5 subnets, and I can pick the subnets. So there is a detailed documentation on the Amazon site about the VPCs and the subnet settings, and Amazon recommends how many subnets you should have when you're creating a cluster. It should be a mix of, I mean, ideally it should be a mix of public and private, because you're going to use the public subnet, which will hit the load balancer, will be to set up the load balancer, and your worker node should be in the private subnet because you don't want any access to the worker node from outside. And all of these should be in a different, so they're, as you can see, they're all over across different um, availability zones. So I'm just going, so this is the important one, the one I created where my pub workers are. So when I create my worker nodes, even for EKS, I'm going to use the private one actually, and then set up the load balancer in the public one. So I don't need others, but I'll just keep them, for now, because ideally I should have set up it requires, I think, 4, so I'll just leave it. Next thing is the security groups. So security groups are basically important because there is a lot of ports need to be open, and a lot of communication goes on between the manager and the worker nodes, especially ports like 102 48 to 55, and then 6443 is anyway for the. So I'm going to choose the, so security groups are basically used for the communication between the manager and the workers. So in this case, our control plane needs to talk to the workers, and some ports need to be open. So I have the launch wizard, my launch wizard 2 and launch wizard 3. I think I'll choose, because my launch wizard 2 and 3 were specifically for the private and public workers. But and I'll so after this I'll just review the security groups, and if something else is needed, then I'll add it. But for now, I'll just keep these two. I don't need the service IP range for now, because it's just like a POC. And cluster endpoint is accessible from outside your VPC. And keep it private for now, because I only want to access it from within my VPC for now, and I want to I don't want anybody from outside accessing it, because that should be actually through a proper through a load balancer, ALB. And ALB should hit your console, and it should all, I mean, the control plane. It should also hit the services. Then we have the pod networking. So pod networking is where all the network communication between the pods happen, and we already discussed in the previous couple of, so I'm just going to do a next, and I don't want to do any logging for now. because this is just a POC. So basically, this is what it is. It's just asking me to review. I have a name, I have a version, I have the role. That's it. I don't want to put any tags for now. And I have my security group, subnet, VPC. I have my private endpoint. I have the various versions for core, DNS, kubeproxy, VPC, CNI. I just left it as it is default, and I'm going to do a create. So it takes a couple of minutes to do it, and once it's ready, then I'm going to come back in the next section.